Hello everyone. Welcome to my channel. My cousin falsely accused me of a terrible crime and had me violently thrown out of the house. Years later, as she was dying, she admitted her lie. But that wasn't enough for me. Hello everyone. I'm 36 years old. And I have a dilemma I'd like to share with you. I'm not sure how I feel. Probably very lonely. I have nowhere else to turn. I've been reading here for a long time and felt this was the best place to share my story. I'd really appreciate any advice you can give me. There is a lot of background to cover, so this is going to be a long post. Let me start by telling you about my cousin Sabrina. She's 35 now, and honestly, she is the worst person I have ever met. I know that sounds harsh and cold, especially because she's my cousin, but for Sabrina, it's the truth. Then there's my mom and dad, both 65 years old, who aren't much better. Something I'll explain in a moment. I've tried to be as Sabrina as I've got older and learned more about psychology and what makes people do terrible things to other people. But at the end of the day, I could never forgive her. To this day, I hate my whole family. Sabrina had a difficult childhood. Her father, my uncle, my father's brother, was the black sheep of the family. He was an abusive, no-good man who drank, smoked constantly, and never worked. He also abused Sabrina. Her mother wasn't much better. I understand what trauma can do to people, especially when they experience abuse at such a young and vulnerable age. But I also believe that it's our responsibility as human beings to work through our trauma so that we don't inflict the same pain on others. Unfortunately, Sabrina never learned this and ended up being very much like her parents in many ways. My parents were well aware of Sabrina's terrible home life. They often tried to intervene. They even reported my aunt and uncle to Child Protection Services. But every time the authorities came, Sabrina's parents always managed to avoid any consequences. Then one day her parents had a car accident. They were driving drunk, crashed into another car, and were killed. Sabrina was left an orphan. Even though her parents were terrible, losing them was still a traumatic experience. Instead of letting Sabrina get lost into the foster care system, my parents stepped in and adopted her. I hadn't spent much time with Sabrina at the time, despite our family gatherings, and all my interactions with her as a had been unpleasant. Nevertheless, I was initially at the idea of having a little sister at home. Of course I was. She was only a year younger than me, but as an only child I often felt lonely and thought it would be nice to have a companion. If only I had known how drastically my life would change after that pivotal moment. I would have begged my parents to send Sabrina to Siberia, because that place is as cold as her heart. My mom and dad weren't perfect parents themselves. They drank too much and weren't very good with money, but they worked hard to provide for me and did their best to support me. But even at a young age, I used to hear my mom complaining to her friends about how she always wanted a daughter instead of a son. She didn't know that I was listening in the next room, but even as a small child I understood those words, and they hurt like a knife. When Sabrina moved into our house, my parents acted as if I didn't exist. I had always been an awkward and introverted child, which disappointed my traditionalist parents. My father, a former high school football captain, couldn't understand how I couldn't even throw a ball without tripping over my laces. I was awkward and never comfortable around girls. Meanwhile, my father had been a notorious ladies' man in his youth. He charmed every girl in town before settling down with my mom. Compared to him, I was a failure. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't get a girl to like me, and my parents were constantly telling me to man up and stop being so weak. My self-esteem was already in the gutter, but when Sabrina arrived, it was completely shattered. My parents adored Sabrina. They praised her for everything she did. If she drew a picture, it would be proudly displayed on the fridge, even if it looked like scribbles. If I drew something, they'd take a quick look at it and put it aside. Sabrina was celebrated for getting B's at school. Well, I got straight A's, and never once heard them say they were proud of me. Sabrina had the best birthday parties, the best Christmas presents, and constant attention. When she started at the same school as me, my social life, which was already bad, crumbled completely. She was in the year below me, but made it her mission to make my life miserable. I was a nerdy, awkward kid, whereas Sabrina was beautiful, sociable, and loved to gossip. She was quickly accepted into the popular crowd, the athletes and cheerleaders, who loved to torment me. Sabrina jumped right in, dating the captain of the football team, who was my biggest bully. He and his friends humiliated me on a daily basis. They shoved my head in toilets and played cruel pranks on me. No matter how hard I tried to avoid them, they always found me. Sabrina never defended me. Instead, she stood on the sidelines, smirking or laughing openly at my pain. She was, without exaggeration, a sociopath. But it wasn't enough for her to make my school life a nightmare. She was determined to make my home life even worse. Living with Sabrina was like being in prison, only to be tortured again the next day at school. The psychological damage this caused me is impossible to overstate. To exaggerate, left permanent scars, and shaped me in ways I'm still dealing with. I tried to tell my parents that Sabrina's friends who were bullying me, but they brushed it off as boys being boys, and taunted me for not being man enough to handle the teasing. My dad would see me with black eyes and bruises and still show no pity. Sabrina, meanwhile, would stand there laughing during these conversations. At home, Sabrina would constantly lie about me. She'd break things in the house and blame me. She would cry and tell my parents that I had hit her. Sometimes her manipulation was so convincing that I began to doubt my own memory. I wondered if I had done the things she accused me of. Of course, my parents believed her every word. I lost count of how many times I was punished for something Sabrina had made up. Over time, this destroyed my self-esteem. I became more depressed and my grades started to drop. Although my grades were still better than Sabrina's, my parents punished me for not trying hard enough. This only deepened my depression and feelings of worthlessness. When my grades dropped, I couldn't get into university. I dreamed of going to university. I was stuck in this town, in this house. I enrolled at the local community college and worked hard to get a degree in engineering degree so I could escape. I wanted nothing more than to get as far from my toxic family as possible. Sabrina, on the other hand, had no plans for her future. She didn't even finish high school. She dropped out early in her final year. She seemed to be with a different guy every week, always partying, and eventually became addicted to drugs. Despite her behavior, my parents continued to support her and made endless excuses for her actions. They weren't happy with her behavior, but they were far too lenient and gave her no incentive to change. During this time, I was still living at home, and Sabrina's abuse of me escalated. I remember vividly one afternoon when she was having a party with her boyfriend at the house. I was trying to study for an exam and politely asked her to turn the music down. Instead of being reasonable, Sabrina told her boyfriend to hit me, and he did. He hit me so hard that I had to call the police. I ended up in hospital with my injuries. Still, my parents and Sabrina insisted that I had overreacted, and even convinced me not to press charges against the idiot. Looking back, I wish I had sued them all. Then came the fateful day when I was 21 years old. That changed my life forever. For context, Sabrina could never stand not being the center of attention. Everything had to be about her. And whenever something went wrong in her personal life, she would take it out on the people around her. Her target was always me. Around this time, Sabrina had been dumped by another boyfriend. This breakup hit her particularly hard. She seemed to think he was the one. In her twisted, immature mind, to make matters worse, this man was the father of her child, Tyron. At this point, Sabrina was already struggling to take care of Tyron properly. Most of the parenting duties had fallen to me and my parents. It was an uncomfortable situation. I had no choice but to put up with it, even though we did everything for her. Sabrina became increasingly bitter and rude. She did very little to look after her own child. Yet she lashed out at anyone who tried to help her. Just before the event that would change my life, Sabrina and I had a fight. This wasn't unusual. We argued all the time and our fights often got heated. It was during this argument that I finally snapped. Sabrina had put me down as usual. She called me a loser, a virgin, and other cruel things. I had had enough. In anger, I told her that every man she dated would eventually leave her, because she was worthless. Sabrina stormed off like a child throwing a tantrum. I didn't think much of it at the time, but apparently Sabrina took my comment very personally. A few days later, I was in my room concentrating on my own things, when my parents burst through the door. I was startled. I wasn't expecting them to barge in like that. I asked them what was wrong, but before I could process anything, I saw several other family members crowding into my room. Then Sabrina came in crying hysterically. She looked inconsolable, but I could tell it was just an act. I had a terrible feeling about what was to come. My stomach sank. When Sabrina accused me of attacking her, my jaw hit the floor. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. At once, I thought about the fight we'd had a few days before. I asked if that was why she was doing this, but my dad cut me off. He shouted at me to stop making excuses. I kept denying the accusations, but nobody believed me. Then came the physical beatings. My whole family turned on me and beat me brutally. It was far worse than any of the countless beatings I had received. I had endured. At school, I was told to pack my things and leave the house. I was immediately reminded that I was lucky that they hadn't reported me to the authorities. I wanted to defend my innocence, but they told me to shut up. To shut up. My whole family disowned me. On the word of Sabrina alone. A spoiled, cruel liar. It was the worst day of my life. At first I didn't know where to go. I had some savings, but they only covered a tiny room. I worked 2 jobs while studying full-time. Eventually I saved enough money to get my own place. I built my life from the ground up, with no help from anyone but myself. Now at 36 years old, I haven't spoken to my family since that fateful day when they disowned me and beat me. But today something unexpected happened. I received a call from Sabrina. The call was from my parents' number, which made me think she was still living with them. I recognized her voice immediately, and just hearing it triggered old traumas. But Sabrina's tone was different. She asked how I'd been, a question she had never asked before. Then she explained that she was dying of terminal cancer. I didn't say anything. She went on to say that she was now a single mother, that Tyron was 17, and that she had another son, Phil, who was 14. She told me that she was divorced, and that her ex-husband was in prison. Then Sabrina apologized. She admitted that God was punishing her for the lies she had told about me. She asked for forgiveness. I told her I needed time to think and hung up. My heart was racing. Not long after, she sent me a text message detailing everything. She repeated how sorry she was. She regretted that her children would grow up without a mother. She admitted that she had been a terrible person all her life. I didn't reply to the text. I'm torn about what to do. Should I forgive Sabrina? I admit, I still hate her with all my heart. Let me know what you think. Update 1. I got a lot of advice. Some urging me to forgive Sabrina, to let go of the burden of hatred, and others reminding me that her terminal illness does not excuse her actions. I have thought long and hard and have made my decision. This may disappoint some of you, but I have chosen the path of vengeance, of revenge. I found Sabrina's Facebook page and tracked down Phil and Tyron through her friends list. I sent them screenshots of her confession. Then I tracked down her ex-husband. Despite being in prison, still had a Facebook profile. I sent him the confession as well. Then I messaged my parents and other relatives with the same confession. I want everyone to know who Sabrina really is. I think the world would be better off without her. I know this won't end well, but at least I feel some relief. Hello everyone. I have another update. Can you believe it? My parents had the audacity to call me today. With a load of nonsense today. It's been 15 years since we last spoke. And to be honest, I never intended to speak to them again. But I should have known they'd try to contact me. After I dropped a bomb about their golden child, Sabrina. To my surprise, my parents apologized. They admitted that they had been wrong to kick me out. On Sabrina's lies alone. Without even hearing my side of the story. I reminded them that they had rejected me. Long before this incident. I think they expected me to be overjoyed by their apology. But I wasn't. They quickly moved on to Sabrina's cancer. They said it was wrong of me to involve her children and ex-husband. They claimed. I should have waited to tell the family. I was blunt and told them I didn't care. I reminded them that they had ruined my life by siding with Sabrina and kicked me out without a second thought. I also pointed out that they had conveniently forgotten how the family physically beat me. Without hearing my side of the story, I was furious and hung up, hoping that I'd never hear from them again. Hello wonderful people. Today is a beautiful day. I have received some incredible news and wanted to share it with you all. My parents called again. I was reluctant to answer, but I thought it might be important. They were sobbing uncontrollably and told me that Sabrina had died that morning. It was only 3 weeks since her confession, and now she was gone. I know that may sound cold and heartless, but I felt nothing when I heard the news. When my parents asked me why I hadn't reacted, I just told them I didn't care. They called me cruel and heartless to say that about my own cousin. But I reminded them that they had abandoned their only son. as they started lecturing and berating me again. I hung up on them, just like before. Sabrina's death is a relief. At least she won't be around to torment me anymore. But I still feel that my family doesn't fully understand the gravity of the situation. To drive the point home, I've decided to teach them one last lesson. Hello everyone, I have another update. And this one is quite satisfying. Let me explain everything. It wasn't hard to find details about Sabrina's funeral. I was surprised they held one at all, considering her reputation. Nevertheless, I made my preparations. I hired a sharp-looking suit and decided to attend uninvited to give my family a little surprise. I arrived late for the service, which had already started. The church was packed, which surprised me, but it worked in my favor. I had a bigger audience for my plan. When the time came for people to speak about Sabrina, I walked up to the podium. I heard someone murmuring. It was him. As if my whole identity revolved around her lie. Then I started my speech. I exposed everything Sabrina had done to me and the rest of the family. I didn't hold back. Even with her children in the audience. They deserved to know the truth about their mother. I also reminded everyone how my family had disowned me without my side of the story. My father stood up and shouted at me to leave. He said I was ruining the funeral and spreading lies. He even threatened to call the police. Before things escalated, Tyron and Phil spoke out. They confirmed everything I had said and revealed how Sabrina had neglected and abused them, spending all their money on drugs and alcohol. The room erupted in chaos. I could see that my family were shaken, as the truth hit them differently from their own children. I left the funeral, satisfied that I'd said what needed to be said. Hi everyone. I wanted to give you one last update. After all that's happened, I found out more about my family's life. My father fell into alcoholism, lost his job and ruined his health. My mother became bitter and lonely, especially after realizing that she had no one to care for her in her old age. After Sabrina's death, Tyron and Phil ended up living with my parents. I didn't think that was a good environment for them. I eventually decided to adopt Tyron and Phil. They contacted me after they heard my speech at the funeral and said they didn't want With the rest of the family, they had nowhere else to go. My parents, not surprisingly, treated them badly. I accused them of sullying Sabrina's memory. Now we live a long way from my toxic family. Tyron and Phil are nothing like their mother, and I'm proud to see them grow into incredible young men.